Nick, I've got to tell you the story of my great grandfather, Abuelo Huevo. He fought in the Spanish Civil War. Well, okay, maybe he didn't fight, but he was a farmer, and so he saw everything that happened. He knew what was going on, right? And so these stories about my grandfather, my great grandfather, one of them, way back when, they've been passed down for all these generations, okay? And so the first thing was which side was he on, right? He was a Republican. He believed in socialism. So there were two big ideologies that I was told about. First, there was socialism. That's government by the people, for the people. It involved a lot of land redistribution. Farmers like my great grandpa, Huelo Huevo, were in it. Miners were in it, industrial workers. And then there was anarchism, which is like socialism on another level. This is no government whatsoever. And anarchism is what really, really, really freaked out the conservatives.
Your grandpa, or was it great grandpa you said, was in the Spanish Civil War too? I think my great grandpa was in it too. Cause he told me the story the other day about just, during the Spanish Civil War, there was like general just like separatism in Spain, like the Basque and the Catalonian country, didn't want to be part of the Spanish state, and they kind of wanted to be their own separate entities. It was a crazy story he was telling me, and he said it created like crazy cultural and economic barriers that like just disrupted the whole country as a whole. Basque and Catalonian parts of the country wanted political autonomy, and when he was young he didn't really understand that, but later on he figured out what they were talking about. And so at the end of his life, towards the end of his life, when he was telling me about this, he was talking in reference to like the political parties in the Basque and Catalonian parts of the country that were like the Liga Regionalista or the Partido Nacionalista Vasco, which was kind of crazy because they were both created to represent the wants and needs of the region. So it just furthered the separatism in the country. And so just he was talking about how separatism just was like the doom of the country, and it just led to a whole bunch of just in general like political instability. Like things were going crazy at the time. And then he was talking about how like when the monarchy collapsed in like the 1920s, I think he said it was like 1923, pretty sure. um he said like the left wing governments failed, and they didn't really um appeal to the conservative right wing people, and then they didn't deliver on like key agrarian and social reforms. And I was like, how were they expected to win if they didn't deliver on what the people wanted, right? Crazy. And then he was talking about the left wing government generally didn't value the core pillars of Spain's culture, which sounds crazy, but then you think the core pillars of Spain were Catholicism and just a generally elite class, which, when the left wing government came in and and just attacked the elite class and undermined Catholicism, they just did not like it one bit. So conservative groups, he was telling me, conservative groups pushed a military officer named Primo. I think he said Primo de Riviera. Crazy name, right? And they led their cause, against the left wing government that was just not doing it for the country. And so he was talking about, the king fell and there was no longer a monarchy. And he was talking about how Riviera kind of like took over via like a military coup. I was like, wasn't that scary? He was like, yeah, it's real scary. Because, he was at the time, he was a young boy and he was like afraid that he was going to get drafted into a war. It was crazy. And he was talking about how the administration pushed for many reforms, but few made it to actual fruition. So I was like, didn't that happen with the left wing government too? He was like, yeah, both governments didn't help the farmers, didn't help the people, didn't do anything. They just did stuff for the elite. Typical government, right? And he says the reforms that were proposed were too light for the left wing critics, but too harsh for the conservative critics. So I was like, well, what did they do? And he said the poor reforms led to, further division, already divided country. And he just said, got worse. And so Riviera eventually kind of stepped down in 1930, which I was like, kind of the Great Depression, which was kind of cool. Um, and he was saying that Riviera stepped down, and then after the reign of Riviera, a republic was established for a short period of time, which was kind of crazy because I was like, republic after dictator, very harsh, flip. And he said the social and economic divisions in Spain were not healed by a tumultuous few years. All that chaos did not solve the issues that all the governments sought out to solve in the first place. My grandpa's crazy. I don't know what he was talking about, but he knew everything in detail.
Nanak, wait. We had a problem, okay? There were some big economic problems that my abuelo Huevo really, really did not like. First, he was a farmer, right? And so he did not like any of the ownership of land. It was like 5 landed elites owned 500 acres type thing. And maybe that is an exaggeration of the numbers, but basically a bunch of farmers worked a bunch of land that was owned by a very, very, very small number of people. Another economic problem that he talked about was the rise of the anarchists. And this was just something that happened. The CNT, the Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, they formed. And it was a big problem for the landed elites because the anarchists were like, we're going to set fire to all your farms and we're going to destroy your fences and it'll be bad. And so to go against these anarchists, to go against the communists, there's the Catholic Agrarian Federation. And a bunch of these were created, but basically it was against the anarchists and the socialists to maintain conservative control. So those were some of the economic problems that my great-grandpa talked about.
Your grandpa was talking about the rise of the anarchists? Wow. Did he talk to you about anything about the trade unions? Because that was a big thing that my grandpa mentioned when he was talking to me about this the other day. At the time he was young. I think he was he was early teenager. And he said his older brother was part of one of these trade unions that was helping the economy of Spain because, through those tumultuous years that I previously mentioned, the social and economic problems were going crazy. And so they needed any solution that they could figure out at all. So he was talking to me about how his brother described to him the latifunda system in southern Spain failed many workers, which I can understand. It's like a plantation system. Workers don't get paid a lot, and the property owners and the landowners get paid a whole lot. Didn't create a good relationship between them. And so he says that the trade unions were created to demand certain treatment and pay for the workers because the workers were treated like trash. That's what he said. His brother was treated like trash, didn't get paid a lot, was not respected. And he said his brother was talking to him about, all the different, trade unions that were in Spain at the time, that were emerging at the time. And he said one of the most notable ones, which he said his brother almost joined, but not quite, he said was the Socialist Union of the Unión General de Trabajadores, which he just called the CNT, which was just, the Union of Workers, which was kind of cool. But it was like a socialist type union that had over 700,000 members. I was like, there's that many workers in Spain? He was like, yeah, at the time, definitely a lot of workers. And, these trade unions demanded things like better pay, better working conditions. They did strikes, protests. And he said for the most part, he was like, it was a lot of ruckus. It looked promising, but in the end, when people went on strikes, landlords just brought in different people and they just paid different workers. And they said the people who were protesting on strike, it did not affect the landowners like they wanted it to. And he said the inefficacy of the unionization just further highlighted the growing divide among the people. He said that, the economy was trash and the trade unions were not helping the economy and they were not bringing the change that they wanted. So the heat and the anger just built up. He said his brother one day came home so angry that he went on this strike for multiple days and was not getting paid. And he said his landowner just completely ignored his demands. And he said trade unions, for the most part, were a bust. They didn't work. He said divisions in Spain were still left unsolved. They didn't change at all. And he said urban trade unions were formed as well, not just the latifunda system, which was in South Spain, which was in kind of like the agrarian part. He was talking about urban trade unions formed as well, as they were tended, lean into the industrialized portions of the country, like the Basque and the Catalonian parts. And he said urban trade unions kind of took after. He said this was really interesting. He was telling me that the trade unions took after, like a style of the Bolshevik, revolution that happened a year earlier. Which I was like, wow, you were alive during the Bolshevik revolution. He was like, yeah, kind of cool, right? And he said, again, trade unions were unsuccessful. Divisions were still present. They didn't solve anything. And he said the presence of unions and themes of uprising created a hostile attitude between the workers and landlords. Yeah, if I protested against you, I wouldn't like you either, right? He said his brother did not like his landowner at all, didn't pay him much, and so he really didn't like him. But I think he was talking about how some of his brother's friends were from like northern Spain, like in the Catalonian and Basque area. He said they were having the same issues in the factories, not necessarily, the same as, agrarian work, but in the factory industry, the owners and the stuff were not respecting their wants and needs too. Weren't you just talking about that?
Okay, but the problems weren't just economic. Like Abuelo Huevo, he had a lot of problems with the religion. So he was pretty crazy. He was secular in the time, which was really unheard of. But there was a big problem with the union of the church and state, okay? The monarch, he had the total support of the Catholic Church. Like, they were best buds, two peas in a pod, right? And the Catholic Church, in exchange for supporting the monarchy, was given some political power. And the Catholic Church, not even some political power, a lot of political power. And the Catholic Church controlled a lot of aspects of daily life, like gender roles, marriages, education, all that. But the rural peasantry, they didn't have a single say in the power of the church. And so they were basically part of the system that maybe their beliefs were being used to keep them in the system that they really didn't like. And so Abuelo Huevo, he had a lot of problems with that.
Okay, I have to tell you about the part where it really gets crazy, where my grandpa was really talking crazy. He said right before the war, the political ideologies were just swinging back and forth, right wing, left wing, right wing, left wing. He said between like in the early 1930s, he said it was like from 1931 and 1936 or something like that. There are 3 different governments in 5 years. I was like, what? I cannot believe it. He said the first left wing government that lasted from like 1931 to 1933 ish, so like only 2 years, with the president being, he said it was like Niceto Alaka or something like that. They had so many presidents back then that he said he could hardly remember. He said the party consisted of radical members for the Radical Party led by Alejandro Lerroux and more leftists from the Spanish Socialist Party, so it was very left wing. And he said the new administration at that time, because it was right after Riviera got taken down, and so, it was a new republic and they were trying to figure out what to do. And he said, that first government, they aimed at passing reforms that address social and economic, inequity within the country, which, they've been plaguing the country for years and years and years. So, why not change that? They wanted to implement agrarian reforms that held landlords more accountable, to treat their workers better. And then they wanted to implement agrarian reforms that gave workers more rights, dismantle the latifunda system, and redistribute some of the wealth amassed by the landlords over the years, which were very, very radical at the time, which, in my opinion, they sound like they would have solved a lot of issues. And he agreed with that too. A lot of his friends were in the latifunda system and they retired and they needed it to be changed forever. And then he said they gave a lot of religious reforms too, which were they were not, the Conservative Party and the conservatives in the country were not about it. They did not like religious reforms. They wanted to further separate the church and state, which, in Spain, the Catholic Church was one with the government. Catholic Church ran schools, ran foundations, ran part of the latifunda system and urban, trade unions and things like that. The Catholic Church was heavily entwined with the, government and work and all that good stuff. That's what my grandpa said, at least. So that government stripped the Catholic Church of many of the unfair rights that they possessed, compared to other large churches and other large religions in the country, which was, need to be fair, but, folks didn't like people stripping away at the fundamentals of Spain. No way. And then he said the military was heavily investigated and restructured to the lingering officers from the previous dictatorship, which, the dictatorship was taken down, but, you can't fire everybody, so there were some people still there, so they had to go up and clean chop. And he said the reforms were met with extra opposition from even internal sources from, the far left wing, which they thought they weren't enough, and then conservatives who thought they were absolutely too much. Particularly the religious reforms had been seen by conservatives as eating away at the fundamental pillars of Spanish society. Sounds very bad. And, at the time, it sounds like since the Catholic Church and the government were so intertwined, maybe they had a point. And then he said that government, they held a general election, and, he voted for that government, but they didn't win. So, an opposing government came in. He said it was like the CETA. He said the first one was like the PSOE or something like that. It was just some liberal leftist party, whatever it is. And he said the CETA, CEDA, came into power, and they said, no, ma'am. They wanted everything changed back. They said, first of all, religious, important, put it back where it was. Military, put it back where it was. They said, agrarian reforms, reverse them. Put them back. Urban reforms, put them back. Latifunding system, put it back. When the majority of the country, the working class, saw progress in government, and the government comes and strips it from you, they're not going to like it. So they had, that falling back to the old days was met with extra, repercussions and opposition from people all over the country who had saw progress during the time under the left-wing government from 1931 to 1933. This government was from 33, I think you said, to 36. So they were only in there for 3 years too. And he said the end of the right-wing government in 1936 was due to a breakdown of the partnership between the Radical Party and the CETA. The CETA pushed two radical reforms, and a general election was called in January in early 1936, which at that point, he said the country saw so much turmoil. My grandpa said the country saw so much turmoil that, he didn't see what was going to happen in the next couple of years. Then, this new party came around, the Popular Front, which was back to the left wing. So, great-granddad, there you go. He voted for the Popular Front. He said it was just like the left-wing government of, the early 1930s. And he said they sought to, continue the reformist agenda with agrarian reform and, Catalonian and Basque autonomy and things like that. But the left-wing government had already, proposed in the first government. And he said reforms were met with even more violent opposition from the conservative parties in the country, along with strong opposition from the left. Themes of the military overthrow. Now, this is where he said it got really scary because people were whispering, about military overthrow and military uprising and violence. And he did not like that at all. He said the CETA became more radical with their leader Gil Robles. He said that was a crazy one. That was a crazy one right there. Very crazy. Involved in a plot to stop the succession of power. Sounds familiar, with the assassin, stop the plot of succession? Oh, no, you can't do that. And then he said when the right-wing leader Jose Calvo Sotelo was assassinated, he said country went straight crazy. Shambles, crazy, insane, whatever. And he said, at that point, that's when he was realizing that, hey, the left-wing government was a little crazy. both sides were crazy, but the left wing government was not innocent at that point. And he said yeah, great. He said far leaning left wing supporters and leaders wanted violent revenge. Violent revenge? On the landlords and other offenders who had been free to offend under the previous right wing government, they said, you know what? Them 2 years and 3 years, we want it back. We coming for you. We coming for you. And he said the PSOE became even more and more and more radical. He said, especially, at the end, right before, really got cracking, he said the underlying themes of communism and socialist ideals, especially ideas of socialist revolutions, were common, prevalent, and at the forefront of everything. And he said, all that commotion, he said it was bound for some military uprising or some type of takeover to happen because people didn't like people. That's how it worked. Okay? And he said the conservatives in the country launched a military takeover in July 1936, and I think he said he went into hiding because he did not want to be drafted in the war. It was crazy. He said it was a long time ago, and there's a lot of things he purposely blanked out, And he said the conservatives in the party launched a military takeover in 1936 against the Popular Front administration. So conservatives said, we going against the government. The party had a military organizer that was lingering from its government, the military, the people that the conservatives used was just the military from that middle right-wing government, and they launched their first military attack, starting the Spanish Civil War in Morocco on July 17th, 1936. And officially, the Spanish Civil War started. It's cracking. What did you say again?
Oh, wait, Nick. There is so much more. Oh my God, there's so many reasons Abuelo Huevo was really mad. Okay, so another one was the global depression, kind of a big deal. It was global. There was really high unemployment. There was low wages in cities, there were low wages. Farmers weren't getting a lot of money. They weren't even getting a lot of money already. So continuously low wages. They were living subsistence, right? And then you saw the Asturian mining revolt in 1934. Now, this was a bunch of miners. They were out of a job. And so they all revolted against the, at the time, conservative government. But they were supposed to be part of a big movement. It was going to be a big deal, change the world type thing. Did not work that way. They were the only ones who ended up fighting. And then I'll talk, maybe this is a story for another time, but basically a lot of people died. A lot of stuff got set on fire, and it honestly set a precedent for these revolts to end in death. So they were shot by the police. It wasn't good. Now, Grandpa Huevo, he was there for a lot. He was there for the De Rivera coup and the authoritarian right. He was there for the Second Republic. He was there for the polarizing reforms, the military reforms, the Right Republic, and the Asturian mining revolt. He was there for everything, man. Okay, so some stories passed on by Abuelo Huevo included the De Rivera coup and the authoritarian right. So basically, De Rivera gained power through a coup, and however, his reforms were too little for the liberals and too much for the conservatives. So he tried to set up different committees, tried to allow some unions, but it wasn't enough, and it didn't work. The liberals didn't like him, the conservatives thought it was too expensive, and so it just alienated both sides. So then you got into the Second Republic, right, which was basically a flip-flop from 1931 to 1936. You started with a left-wing government, followed by a right-wing government, followed by a left-wing government, and they were all just reversing the reforms of each other, so polarizing reforms. My grandpa was like, left-wing government, finally, yay, I'm going to get some money as a farmer, and then the right-wing government came in, and the right-wing government was like, we don't like that. You're trying to overturn the social order, so we're just going to reverse everything that you just tried to do. And then so they were back in conservative things, and then the liberal government comes back and no, that's wrong. We have to support the people and the farmers and the anarchists and the communists, and maybe not the anarchists because they give us a bad rep, but and so my abuelo was like, yeah, we love this, but it created a bunch of instability and turmoil that could really be a problem. Then military reforms, oh my God. So when the liberal government was in power, this was something that my abuelo supported because he really did not like the military. And so basically any conservative military generals, including Big Bad General Franco, they got removed from their offices. They lost their power, and they were replaced by pro-Republican generals. And so Republicans were like, woo, rejoice. And the military was like, grr, and they were simmering underneath. They went to, I was about to say Australia, but they went to Africa. And they were mad, man. They were really mad. This is going to be bad when the Spanish Civil War broke out. And so then the Right Republic came, and they, like I said, they repealed all progressive legislators. They made it much harder to strike, to unionize, and there was a lot of violence under them, and they would honestly be the precedent for when Franco came into oppressive control. So, no, this is a lot. And then the Asturian Mining Revolt, I told you about that a little bit already, but just some numbers, because I said maybe it was a story for another day, so I got you right now. Basically, so they revolted. Hooray, union strikes, right? But the revolters, they burned 58 churches. Not the best way to support your cause. They burned 58 churches, but the response was also not the best way to support a cause, in that the police killed 1,335 people and wounded another 3,000. So it was pretty bloody, it was pretty violent, and it unfortunately set a norm, it standardized it. It normalized this violence against civilians. And Abuelo Huevo, when he heard about it, man, he got scared, because he knew that worse could come.
Sorry, I had to move. My grandpa was having an episode in the other room, so I had to avoid that at all cost. So one thing you were talking about that really, came across to me with my grandpa, was the threat of just civil war. Like I was talking about earlier, when the Republicans and the far left-wing nationalists were just going at each other, civil war was just looming. He knew it was. So when it broke out, it was obviously, side versus side, internal conflicts, and like your friends were turning against you, because people supported who they supported. And it involved every person in the society. He said everybody was affected by the war. Everybody. All grandmas, mamas, babies affected by the war. What were you talking about again?
Okay, so I've been going through some of the research, some of the stuff that's been passed down about Abuelo Huevo, and I found a little bit about the strategies and tactics that he said went down during the Spanish Civil War. So, okay, I'm looking at it right now, and I saw that it was a defensive war, which meant that the Republicans, they tried to defend the territory. They didn't try to seek anything new, and Republicans launched an attack in response to a military uprising, so it was defensive. It was a war of attrition, so which is basically like who can hold out for the longest. That's where you get the sieges. That's where you try to limit supplies, whatever it is. And nationalists generally won those. They had some more international support. They had better access to supplies, etc. But story for another day. There was also a war of terror. And so what they used was propaganda. Now, propaganda is honestly one of my favorite things to say about the wars. I think it reflects a lot on like the societal values. But so basically the Republicans had a very specific style, and they said nationalists, they are all monsters, all of them. But what they did that so that they could get some sympathy and support. Then you saw international brigades. It worked. Like people from the U.S. came over, Canada. They're like, we gotta fight for democracy abroad too. And so they got some help from the international brigades. Not that they were actually much help, but they came. We love the intent, right? The energy. Nationalists, however, decided to paint the Republicans as totally chaotic, as, anarchists, which some of them were. And they wanted international support for fascism, as like, fascism will lead to order, which, it ultimately got that, which is sad. There were also massacres, which is absolutely terrible, and I don't want to reduce the severity of it, but I'm going through quickly because I know we don't have a ton of time. So there was the massacre of Badajoz, which was on the way to Madrid. The nationalists, or the Army of Africa, murdered 2,000 people. Yeah. So it was often the nationalists killing civilians and Republican militiamen. There were a lot of massacres, and even after the war, there were often times where Republicans would be put in front of firing squads, which was not good at all. And then bombing raids also happened, which were mostly in northern Spain, done by the nationalists using German aircraft. And the most notable one was Guernica, which you've seen in the Picasso probably, where over 1,500 people were killed, and most of them civilians, which, like a lot of bombing raids, it set a norm where that civilians who aren't involved in the war at all were the ones being killed. And that, however, Republicans tried to use it to fuel their anti-nationalist propaganda, which again did work, but, didn't reverse the death toll. So The war of terror, the terror was real. Civilians were terrified. My abuelo Huevo, man, he was glad he was in the countryside in this case, even though his wages were absolutely terrible. At least his city, where his little farming area wasn't being bombed at all times like in northern Spain. So, yeah, it's pretty rough.
That's crazy that your abuelo huevo, however you say it, mentioned bombing raids because that was something that my great grandpa specifically mentioned when he was talking to me. And, in the bombing raids, he was kind of just talking about the general technology and the kind of, in every bad situation, you have to look at the good parts. And he was talking about the technology and the new cool stuff that came about because of the war. He was talking about how like aircraft and reconnaissance aircraft were used by either side to to see over enemy lines, which you know it sounds cool, but it's still a war. And like you were talking about bombings, the planes would fly over, bomb stuff, and gain territorial and tactical advantages over each side. And then he also mentioned tanks, which I didn't really, didn't think of in the moment. When he was talking about, stuff that really changed the war, he was like the full potential of motorized combat vehicles, like in the military, were really used in the Spanish Civil War. So he said tanks provided from the German Panzer tanks, and then either all the way to the Soviet T-26 tanks, probably each side with territorial advantages that they didn't have before the war. Before the Spanish Civil War thing, tanks were not a thing. And then he was mentioning one more thing. I have to think. Oh, okay, here I got it. And he said one more thing that Spain used, which was kind of like not as influential as tanks and aircraft and all those things, was warships. He said the Spanish Navy played a key bit in getting the supply and things like that to supply specific really the Republicans, but both sides had their fair share, of warships and naval accommodations to help them get supplies and blockades and things like that. Especially the nationalist blockades were more successful. That's what he was talking about. Even though he kind of sided with the Republicans, even though they were a little violent, he sided with the Republicans, and he didn't like the nationalist blockades and things like that. But that's what he was talking about.
Okay, sorry, I had to move again. Crazy stuff's happening. So I also want to talk about the immediate aftermath, the war in general, because we're talking about, the before and all that stuff that's leading up. I want to get to the meat and potatoes of the stuff. So immediately after the conservative attack on Morocco, the subsequent battles within Spain completely divided the country into areas controlled by conservative nationalists. That's what my grandpa told me, at least. He said, there were literally sprinkles of differently controlled areas within all of Spain, with, like, for instance, Barcelona and Madrid under Republican control, and like Catalonia and the Basque Country under Republican control, but like all the countryside and all the southern parts of Spain and North Africa all controlled by nationalists. It was extra divided. And then he was also talking about, with these division of territories, the Republicans controlled the big cities, like I said. And he says the nationalist goal was to take the key city that remained under Republican control, Madrid. Because if they could take Madrid, and they could just make the Republicans look really bad and just beat them all the way. So, accompanied by national forces from northern Africa, the conservative nationalists marched northward to Madrid. They were going. This is what he was telling me. He said, remember, to Madrid, the nationalist forces easily overthrew smaller towns and smaller cities that were just in the way, get out of the way. Like Merida and Badajoz. He was talking about there were so many cities that were just like sacked in 2 days. He said it was very scary because he was a liberal. I mean, in his mind, he was a liberal, but he was kind of in hiding and not really involved in the war. And then he said that, he had friends who saw that, like, the people, the nationalist forces would go in caravans of trucks and planes, and it was like a wave, and it was so scary. And then he said, When they were progressively getting closer to Madrid, the nationalist forces made it to the fortress of Alcazar, which, fortress, you think, ooh, ooh, ooh. And you're right. The nationalist forces were not prepared for the Republican, forces that were going to be at the fortress of Alcazar. And, it turned into a stalemate quickly. So the nationalist forces had to divert and go to a slightly eastern city of Toledo. That diversion was key. That diversion gave the Republican forces in Madrid, kind of further away, time to better prepare because they knew the folks were coming. And it also gave the Republican troops in the fortress of Alcazar even more time to reinforce your defense in that part. And he says that change in course. And then he said weeks later, this is what he was talking about. He was like, just weeks later, the nationalists made a second attempt on Madrid by bombarding the city with artillery rounds on days on end. He said it was crazy. He said reports from friends that they just were lighting them up day and night. And he said by bombarding the city with artillery rounds on days on end, then the force in Madrid put an equal fight. They couldn't break through Madrid. They couldn't break the Republican forces in Madrid. And then he said that was mainly because, like you said, Lily, the support of the USSR from the Republicans got support from the USSR with men and tanks and everything. So that was their key vital line. And he said the nationalist forces turned their eye towards the region of Catalonia and Basque because they said, you know what, we can't get Madrid. We need to figure out something else to get Madrid. So what they thought was to, by very questionable tactics, they, through like aerial bombardment of innocent towns and like infernos and crazy stuff like that, they took control of the Catalonian and Basque country. So they strangled the industrial sector of the Republican forces. So Madrid and Barcelona, like you were talking about, had no supplies. They just had the USSR, and that wasn't enough. So the Republicans were at a glaring disadvantage territorially. And then, of course, internally within the Republican, not party, but Republican leadership, there was an internal conflict from the far left who thought the more central dominant left who was in control was not doing enough. They needed to, go crazier, go harder, and not let the nationalists take so many things easily. And so that little conflict happened in Barcelona, and they had literally militias of Republican versus Republican going at it in Barcelona, wasting time, wasting resources. Eventually, the more prominent, more dominant, moderate left, beat out the little outcast of the far left, and that was in May 1937. That's what he was talking about. And then he said at that time, a new Republican leader, which he said this was hopeful because he thought something was going to happen out of this, Juan Negrin, came to lead the new Spanish Traditionalist Party, which was just a more moderate left traditionalist party of the Republicans who were still fighting in the war, who were still involved in battles and everything like that. And he said they were in that position to the end of the war until further things happened, like you're about to talk about, I think, because you were just talking about it earlier.
Okay, so I know this is everyone's favorite part of learning about wars. And so I decided, Nick, to tell you this while wearing a green cowboy hat, because why not? Maybe it'll make it more interesting. I mean, it's very serious again, but so my cowboy hat. So things that happened. Madrid was besieged in 1936 by an aerial bombardment by the nationalists. Republicans allayed the attacks through using Soviet tanks and aircraft, and they had more soldiers. They had more militiamen at this early point in the war, and it resulted in a stalemate in western Madrid. Then this was followed by Barcelona falling. In 1939, there was no fight, basically, from Republicans. So this was totally different from Madrid being besieged. They had way less men, they had way less material compared to the nationalists, who were getting a lot more support. So 1939, there was no fight from the Republicans. They ran out of men, they ran out of material, there were aerial bombardments again. They were isolated from the rest of Republican Spain, which had fallen to the Army of Africa, and they were utterly demoralized. Even some actual Republican, like generals, military men, they were like, we put up no fight. There was nothing left. People didn't know what to do. And so Barcelona, it fell within a day. And then Madrid fell in 1939. The president himself he resigned after the fall of Barcelona. So Franco was thus recognized by Britain and France as the head of Spanish government. Conservative politicians and military leaders were established, they were not established. So they then, in a rebellion, conservative politicians and military leaders and the Republican government rebelled and established an anti-communist junta. So, yeah. Okay, Franco didn't want a conditional surrender, though. The junta was like, let's surrender conditionally, right? And Franco was like, no, we're going to win this war. Totally. And so with only 500,000 Republican troops, the Army of Africa occupied and thus won Madrid easily. Again, not much of a fight. So the end of the war, 500,000 Republican troops remaining, civil conflicts, as we discussed, within the Republican government. Negrin, who was the head of the Spanish government prior to Franco, his outlasting strategy didn't work. He lost the support, which led to civil conflicts, as I mentioned. Republican troops were demoralized. They were low on supplies. The Army of Africa was better trained, and thus it won. And again, Franco was recognized by Britain and France as the legit Spanish leader. So ultimately, after many long years, Spain fell to Franco and his men.
Okay, you were just talking about the end of the war. It ended, and then one thing my grandpa was talking about, he was talking about how even though he kind of sided with the Republicans in many instances, he says the initial kind of start of the war, which, now he's old now, and he says he reads about it a lot because it's a big part of his life. And, he said he agrees with this one historian who was basically saying that, the Republicans, even though they didn't start the war literally by, throwing the first stone or initiating the first battle, they're, radical, extremists, which were very much a part of their, party, just, flamed, waft the flame of the forces that were in, the conservative forces and things like that. So he says basically that they were too radical and that their views were going to be opposed and going to be fought against no matter what. So he says, in a way, the Republicans were kind of responsible for it. And you were talking about something else.
Hey, we have a special guest to tell us about views on the Spanish Civil War. Joey, what's up? Hi, Joey. Joey Roberts, what do you think of what happened? This was an interesting development. Below, what do you think? Okay, so here's what Joey thinks about the Spanish Civil War. He thinks that it was actually the nationalists who started it, right, Joey? He says right. So the nationalists started it because the nationalists were the ones who were violent, and so the Republicans were just trying to live their lives. They were like, we just want to have good wages. We just want to be able to survive. We want to have our unions. And the nationalists decided that they were going to kill the Republicans because of that. Again, Abuelo Huevo was really, really mad. And so, yeah, the Republicans blamed the nationalists for being violent in response to these progressive and seemingly totally reasonable reforms. And that is what Senor Joey thinks. And unfortunately, he left the room before he could tell you that himself. So I'm trying to speak for him. Hopefully I captured all of that accurately.
I'm sure Joey and Molly will love each other, but Molly's a delinquent. But yeah, this was a dope conversation, about Abuelo Huevo and my great-grandpa. I didn't know they had so much in common. I didn't know they were alive at the same time, But yeah, I hope we can talk about this more in the future.
Okay, so I really enjoyed our conversation today, Nick. Thank you for telling me all about your grandpa, your great-grandpa. I don't even know. I've lost track at this point. Thank you for telling me all about him and his experiences in the Spanish Civil War. I hope you enjoyed the experiences of Abuelo Huevo. But obviously, we have a lot of IB work to do. I need to get back to bed. Gotta, rock this cowboy hat some more. I don't even know why I said that, but I love my cowboy hat. I love my bunny robe. It's a fun time. And so, yeah, again, thanks for this conversation, Nick. I feel like I learned a lot. I've definitely forgotten some by now. So, yeah, you're awesome. Keep being cool. I'm going to keep being cool. And hopefully I can hear more from Joey about what he thinks of Abuelo Huevo's story.
Definitely. See you later.